Welcome to Sleepless Philosophers. Tonight's story begins with a quiet horror. What if nothing ever truly stays the same? Not a ship, not a person, not even the self that thinks this thought. This is the paradox that breaks the brain slowly. If something changes one grain at a time, when does it become something else entirely? If a memory fades but leaves a feeling behind, is it still the same memory? If a body replaces every cell, is it still the same person? These aren't riddles, they're traps, and we live inside them. If you enjoy these strange bedtime puzzles, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. We post every single day, so there's always something new waiting when the night is long. And tell us, where are you listening from? What time is it in your world? Comment below. We read them all in the candlelight. Now let's walk slowly into one of the oldest puzzles ever whispered through the halls of philosophy, the ship of Theseus, a thought experiment so simple a child can grasp it, and so complex it can unravel your sense of self. The story is this: Theseus, the great Greek hero, had a ship. Over time, its wooden boards began to rot. One by one, they were replaced. A new plank here, a new mast there. Years passed. Eventually, every single piece of the ship had been swapped. Not a splinter of the original wood remained. And yet, people still called it the ship of Theseus. It still had the same shape. It had sailed the same seas. It remembered, in its own way, the stories of its voyages. But here's the twist. Somewhere, someone had been saving those old boards, the rotting ones, carefully preserving each one. And when enough were gathered, they rebuilt the ship from the original materials. Now there are two, one made entirely of new parts, one made from the old. Which one is the true ship of Theseus? Which one holds the soul of the journey? This isn't just about boats, it's about everything. Cells in the human body are constantly dying, shedding, replacing. Skin renews every month, bones every decade. The brain rewires, the memories rearrange. There is no static self. And yet, we speak as if I is a solid thing, a name, a story, a core. But what if that core is just a story stitched together from fragments, half remembered and reimagined? The Roman philosopher Plutarch first told the tale of Theseus's ship, but it has never left us. It echoes in psychology, biology, metaphysics. It haunts transplants, brain injuries, dementia wards. Imagine a man who undergoes a complete personality shift after an accident. Is he still the man he was? Legally, perhaps. Biologically, mostly. But spiritually, emotionally, his wife might say no. His friends might not know how to speak to him anymore. If he loses the memories, does he lose himself? Questions like these expose the cracks in our assumptions. They show how fragile identity is. In the 1600s, philosopher Thomas Hobbes complicated the thought even more. What if someone took the old planks of Theseus's ship and built a new ship from them, while the restored one was still sailing? Now there are two ships claiming to be the original. Same materials, same design, different continuity. Which matters more, history or structure? Continuity or composition? We face this paradox in modern ways too, with AI, for example. If we upload someone's consciousness into a machine, is it still them? If the machine speaks with their voice, remembers their childhood, feels their regrets, who are we speaking to? The same person, or a copy wearing a perfect mask? And what about people who change slowly? A man who starts lying to himself more and more, until one day he doesn't even remember who he was being honest for. Or a woman who breaks herself to become who the world told her to be. Are they still themselves? Or someone else entirely, built one compromise at a time? Philosophy doesn't give easy answers. It asks questions that multiply like shadows under flickering light. The paradox of identity is not meant to be solved, it's meant to be noticed. To disturb us softly. Friedrich Nietzsche once wrote, "We are all strangers to ourselves." Perhaps that's the heart of it. We live as if we are whole, but we are fragments pretending, layers pretending to be a single surface. In Buddhism, the self is called an illusion, a temporary gathering of sensations, thoughts, and habits. Nothing permanent, nothing fixed, just like the heap of sand that disappears one grain at a time, or appears from nothing the same way. It's the same paradox, again and again. When does a collection become a thing? When does a thing stop being itself? There's a Greek word, kainotomia. It means a new cut, a moment when something changes so fundamentally it becomes something else. Most changes don't feel like that. They are slow, silent. They creep in, not crash down. One compromise, one forgotten dream, one adjusted boundary. And one day, we look in the mirror and ask quietly, when did I become this? Or worse, was I always this and just didn't see? Theseus's ship sails in every person, in every relationship, in every belief that shifts slightly each year, until it becomes something unrecognizable, wearing the same name. Even cultures change this way. One law altered here, one idea banned there, and one day, a society wakes up unable to recognize its own reflection. So here we are, still asking the same question, not just about ships or sand or brains, but about ourselves. What does it mean to remain yourself? Can a soul be slowly replaced and still remain whole? Or is identity nothing more than the memory of continuity, the illusion of sameness over time? No one knows, but the paradox is real, and it whispers in every mirror, in every photograph where the smile looks familiar, but not quite, in every story we tell ourselves to stay intact. What is the self, if not a ship sailing through time, rebuilt each day, pretending not to notice the drift? We'll continue tomorrow with another paradox, another trap for the mind, another candle flickering in the dark. The paradox of the heap is not a trick, it is not a riddle, it is something far more disturbing, because it touches everything we believe about categories, labels, and where one thing ends and another begins. Imagine a single grain of sand, no one calls that a heap. Add another, still not a heap. Add another, then another. At what point does it become a heap? Is it 5? Is it 50? Is it 5,000? There is no clear line, and yet we speak as if there is. This is the Sorite's paradox, named from the Greek word for heap. It is quiet, simple, but it breaks logic down into dust, because it shows us that many things we believe in, baldness, wealth, adulthood, justice, are just vague categories built on invisible thresholds. A man with a full head of hair is not bald. Take away one strand, still not bald. Take away another, still not bald. But repeat this process 1,000 times and suddenly he is. When? At which precise hair did the identity flip? No one knows. We invent the category of bald because it's convenient, but in truth, it's a blur. The world is full of these blurred lines pretending to be sharp. When does a fetus become a person? When does a child become an adult? When does an old man become senile? These are not abstract questions. They are questions that decide laws, lives, identities, and they are all built on sand. The philosopher Eubulides first posed this paradox in ancient Greece, thousands of years ago, but the world still hasn't answered him. In modern times, philosophers like Timothy Williamson have tried to fight the vagueness. He argues that there might be a sharp boundary, we just don't know where it is. Others say no, the boundaries themselves are fiction. There are no true dividing lines, only illusions of difference created by human minds that crave order. It's tempting to laugh it off, to say it's just wordplay, but it's not, it's everywhere. Think of morality. At what point does a white lie become a serious deception? At what point does self-interest become selfishness? At what point does discipline become cruelty? There is no grain that marks the change, only a slow drift, until we arrive somewhere we never intended to be. This is how systems fall apart. Not all at once, but one exception at a time. One justified compromise, one overlooked rule. And then suddenly, the whole pile is gone, or a new one has formed. and no one can say when the shift occurred. Political ideologies evolve this way. A movement begins with hope, then it becomes militant, then it becomes authoritarian. But no single moment defines the turn. History looks back and draws a line, but the people living through it never saw the boundary. They just felt the slope. Relationships fall apart the same way, not with a fight, but with small silences, missed glances, words unsaid, until one day love becomes memory, and no one can say when. Was it Tuesday? Was it after that dinner? Was it when they stopped touching each other in sleep? The line is always invisible. That is the horror of gradual change. It does not knock, it creeps, it mimics continuity, and by the time we realize it, it has already happened. Psychologists call this the slippery slope. Logicians call it vagueness. But the truth is simpler. Humans live in a world of fuzzy edges, pretending they're sharp. The law tries to be exact, but even there, vagueness seeps in. What is reasonable doubt? What is intent? What is obscene? Judges write pages trying to define them, but in the end, they feel their way through. Because the mind does not run on logic. It runs on feelings, and feelings do not draw clean lines. The Sorite's paradox is often used in debates about identity and change. Trans identity, racial identity, national identity. Who counts as what? When does the category switch? These debates burn through society like wildfires, but under the heat is the same quiet question. How many grains does it take? At what point is a line crossed? And who gets to say? In Buddhism, the answer is simple. There are no things, only processes. Nothing is static, nothing is fixed. You are not a noun, you are a verb, always changing, always flowing. To call something a heap, or a person, or a nation is just a convenient fiction. Useful perhaps, but not real. Schopenhauer once said, "Every man takes the limits of his own field of vision for the limits of the world." That is the illusion. We believe in categories because they help us feel safe. But the world is not made of categories. It is made of gradations. Everything is a matter of degree. Even truth, even memory, even selfhood. Consider digital identity. A person who curates their Instagram feed, edits their photos, polishes their brand. At what point does the persona become more real than the person? When the image is repeated enough? When the real self starts to imitate it? What if they no longer know the difference? That too is a heap problem. One small edit at a time, until the mask becomes the face. There's a strange comfort in this paradox if you sit with it long enough. If there are no fixed boundaries, then nothing is ever final. No failure permanent, no success absolute, no identity locked. Everything is open, everything can shift, even pain, even joy, even the stories we've told ourselves about who we are. But that comfort is also unsettling. If everything can change, then what can we hold on to? Where is the core? Where is the real? Maybe there isn't one. Maybe the only truth is the drift itself. One grain, one moment, one decision at a time. Until one day, we look around and realize we're somewhere new. We don't remember getting here, but we did, slowly. And now we must decide, do we still call this a heap? Time travel is a fantasy, but its paradoxes are real. Even if the machine is fiction, the logic traps are very much alive. They exist in thought experiments, in ethics, in physics, and in the strange way memory works. The mind already travels through time, recalling, rewriting, forgetting, predicting, rehearsing. But tonight, we step into the deeper nightmare. The paradoxes of time travel reveal something uncomfortable, not about the future or the past, but about the limits of reason itself. Let's start with the grandfather paradox. A man builds a time machine. He travels back 60 years and meets his grandfather before he ever met the man's grandmother. The man then kills his grandfather or prevents him from meeting the grandmother. If he succeeds, he was never born. But if he was never born, then who went back in time to stop the grandfather? And if he didn't go back, then the grandfather lives, and the man is born. And if he is born, he can go back. And so on. A loop, an impossibility, a logical black hole. Some try to escape this trap by invoking parallel timelines, alternate universes, a multiverse in which each change creates a new branch. But this is not an escape, it's a multiplication of the same paradox. In every version, causality bends in on itself. Time becomes a snake, eating its own tail. The Ouroboros. But that's just the start. Consider the bootstrap paradox. A man receives a mysterious book filled with future technology. He studies it, uses it to change the world. Then he travels back in time and gives the book to his younger self. Where did the book come from? It has no origin. It exists in a closed loop. Never written, never created, just passed endlessly from future to past. Information without a source. Knowledge that came from nowhere. This breaks not just time but ontology. It breaks the idea that things must have beginnings, that causes must come before effects. And yet, our world flirts with this logic already. Memes spread without origin. Ideas circulate and replicate, losing their source. Urban legends. Quotes misattributed. Cultural habits whose roots are forgotten. The bootstrap paradox lives in folklore, in TikTok trends, in religion. A miracle story passed down so many times that no one knows who told it first. But it persists, outside time. Time travel also raises questions about determinism. If the past can be changed, then the future is not fixed. But if someone from the future appears in the past, their actions must have already happened, which means the timeline is set, which means free will dissolves. Philosopher David Lewis argued that time travel is logically possible, but only if the traveller cannot change the past. He can be there, he can witness it, but he cannot alter it. Whatever he does was already part of the timeline. He cannot kill Hitler unless history records that he did. He cannot save a life unless it was always saved. He is trapped in destiny, even while jumping through time. But this too raises questions. If he cannot change anything, then what is the point of travelling? And if he can, then how can paradox be avoided? It's the same problem in disguise. Time is not just a line, it is a chain. Every link depends on the last. Change one, and the rest tremble. Physicist Kip Thorne once explored the idea of closed time-like curves, paths in space-time that loop back to their origin. They are theoretically allowed by general relativity, wormholes, cosmic strings. But if they exist, they would allow causality loops, which means paradoxes, which means everything we think we know about before and after could break down. Time would no longer be a road. It would be a Mobius strip, twisted, borderless, non-linear. Even memory plays tricks with time. Trauma can freeze it. Nostalgia can falsify it. Regret rewrites it. Anticipation distorts it. The brain is a time traveller, creating alternate pasts to survive the present. In therapy, patients sometimes discover memories that feel real but are not, emotional truths that contradict historical facts. And yet they shape identity, behaviour, love, guilt. The paradox is not just in physics, it is in lived experience. How can someone be shaped by a moment that never happened? How can a false memory become the root of a real trauma? These are time loops of the mind. In dreams, time becomes elastic. A 10-minute nap can hold what feels like hours. In the instant before death, a lifetime can flash by. We live in time, but do not understand it. We measure it, track it, fear it, but we cannot touch it. Augustine of Hippo once said, "What then is time? If no one asks me, I know what it is. If I wish to explain it to him who asks, I do not know." That was 1,600 years ago. It is still true. Modern physics gives us equations. Einstein showed that time is not absolute. It dilates, it stretches. A clock on a satellite ticks faster than one on Earth. A clock on a plane ticks slower. Gravity bends time. Speed bends time. But no one knows what time is. Some think it doesn't exist at all. Julian Barber argues that time is an illusion, that the universe is a collection of frozen moments, like frames of film. We only perceive motion because our minds link the frames. But in truth, nothing moves. Everything just is. Time does not pass, we pass through it. This idea sounds absurd until you realize it explains everything. Why the past cannot be revisited, why the future cannot be reached. Why now is always the only thing we ever touch, yet the desire to escape time is ancient. Myths of immortality, dreams of going back, of undoing, of redoing, these are all protests against time's tyranny. Regret is time travel, in reverse. It is the body remembering what the mind cannot change. Hope is time travel forward, a projection, a fantasy of control. And when we look at an old photograph, we time travel with our eyes. We visit a moment that is gone, and yet it stares back. The face of a child who no longer exists. The smile of someone who thought they had forever. The paradox is this: we can't return, but we are never really free of where we've been. So what if time travel were possible? Would it be freedom or a trap? If we could change one thing, would we change everything? Would we lose ourselves in the process? What if saving someone in the past meant erasing the person we became because they were lost? What if healing the past broke the present? Would we still do it? These questions are more than science fiction. They are the quiet background hum of every decision, every what if, every if only. Time travel is not just a machine. It's a thought, a temptation, a wound. And like all great paradoxes, it teaches us through contradiction. It shows us the limits of knowing, the fragility of logic, and the tragic beauty of being trapped in one direction with only memory and imagination to stretch the rails. The arrow of time moves forward, but the mind lives in loops. There is a strange paradox in the human mind. It is not about logic or physics or time, but about truth itself. A person can hear a lie 1,000 times and begin to believe it, not because it makes sense, not because it has evidence, but because it is familiar. This is the Illusory Truth Effect, and it might be the most quietly dangerous psychological trap ever discovered. It works like this: the more you hear something, the more likely you are to believe it's true, even if you knew it was false at first, even if you were told explicitly that it was wrong. Repetition rewires reality. In 1977, a team of psychologists, Hasher, Goldstein, and Topino, ran a study. They gave people a series of statements, some true, some false. Then they repeated some of the false ones. The result? The repeated lies were rated as more believable, just because they were familiar. This effect is so strong it overrides knowledge. People who know the fact still fall for the lie if they hear it enough times. It doesn't matter how smart someone is. It doesn't matter if they trust science. The brain is not a perfect machine. It is a creature of habit. Familiarity feels like safety, and safety feels like truth. The effect has been replicated in dozens of studies, even when people are warned about it in advance, even when the source of the information is labelled as unreliable. The repetition wins. It always wins. This is why propaganda works. It's not about making sense. It's about making noise. Repeat the slogan, repeat the image, repeat the message, and slowly, the mind accepts it. This is how myths spread, how false memories form, how people start to believe that vaccines are dangerous, or that the earth is flat, or that a politician is honest. Not because of logic, but because of repetition. The human mind is wired for shortcuts. Repetition means familiarity. Familiarity means comfort, and comfort gets mistaken for truth. This is not a flaw in some people. It is a flaw in everyone. It is how the brain conserves energy. Evaluating truth takes work. Thinking deeply is metabolically expensive. So the brain takes the easy path. If it's familiar, it must be safe. If it's safe, it must be true. But that logic becomes a weapon. It means that truth can be hijacked. It means that belief can be manufactured. Nazi propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels knew this. He said, "Repeat a lie often enough and it becomes the truth." This was not just a theory, it was a method. And it worked. Entire populations believed stories that made no sense. Not because they were coerced, but because they were comforted. Repetition creates illusion. Illusion creates belief. And belief resists correction. Once a false belief is embedded, correcting it is almost impossible. In fact, trying to correct it often makes it stronger. This is known as the backfire effect. When a belief is challenged, the brain protects it. The person doubles down, defends the lie, justifies it, because now it's part of who they are, part of their identity. And identity is sacred to the mind. It is easier to change facts than to change the self. So the paradox deepens. The more false something is, the more it must be repeated to survive. But the more it is repeated, the more people believe it. Truth becomes a prisoner of volume. The loudest wins. This happens in politics, in advertising, in social media. Lies go viral. Truth takes the stairs. But by the time it arrives, the crowd has already chosen their side. The illusion has already settled in. Consider the myth that we only use 10% of our brains. It has been debunked countless times. Yet surveys still show that most people believe it. Why? Because it has been repeated in movies, in books, in casual conversation. It has become sticky, familiar, and so it feels true. Or take the idea that sugar makes kids hyper. Study after study shows no link. But the myth persists because it's been repeated, and the repetition is louder than the correction. The illusory truth effect explains more than just false beliefs. It explains brand loyalty, political tribalism, conspiracy theories, even religious devotion. Anything that is repeated often enough becomes difficult to doubt. Because doubt is work, and repetition is easy. This is why cults repeat mantras, why commercials repeat jingles, why politicians repeat sound bites. They are not trying to persuade, they are trying to imprint, to bypass the logical mind and slip into the emotional one. It works because the emotional brain doesn't care about evidence, it cares about pattern, it cares about rhythm, and rhythm feels like truth. Think about how many ideas are accepted simply because they've been heard before. Not because anyone checked them, just because they echo, like the idea that opposites attract, or that lightning never strikes the same place twice, or that you should wait 24 hours before filing a missing person report. None of these are true, but they've been repeated, and so they live. But here's the quiet horror. This effect can be used on the self. If someone tells themselves they're worthless and repeats it enough, it becomes a belief. Even if it started as a fear, even if it was never true, the mind doesn't care. It listens to repetition, and the repetition becomes real. This is how trauma shapes identity, not through logic, but through loops. A person thinks, "I don't matter." They feel it, say it, think it again, and eventually it hardens, becomes a truth, a lens, a trap. But the same trick can work in reverse. If someone repeats a new belief, "I am healing, I am strong, I am learning." At first it feels false, but with repetition, the brain adapts, begins to believe, begins to shift. The illusion works both ways. The question is, who controls the loop? Is it chosen or implanted? Conscious or passive? Are the thoughts ours or echoes? The philosopher Kierkegaard said, "People demand freedom of speech as a compensation for the freedom of thought which they seldom use." And maybe he was right, because thought itself is vulnerable. It is shaped by repetition, not by truth, but by what feels true. And what feels true is what we hear the most. That is the paradox. Familiarity builds belief, but belief is not truth. Repetition creates confidence, but confidence is not certainty. And the most dangerous falsehood is the one that sounds like something we've heard before. In a world of algorithms and viral content, This matters more than ever. The loudest lie wins. The most repeated idea becomes the most trusted. And if we're not careful, we start to mistake volume for validity, quantity for quality, echoes for evidence. So what can be done? Awareness is the first step. Knowing that the mind is vulnerable to this trick. Knowing that repetition is not a signal of truth. That just because something feels true doesn't mean it is. That a comfortable thought can still be a cage. The mind is not a mirror. It is a sponge, and it soaks up whatever is around it. So choose what surrounds it. Choose the voices, the thoughts, the loops. Because in the end, what we believe shapes who we become, and what we repeat, we begin to believe. Even if it's not real, especially if it's not real. That is the paradox. That is the danger. And that is the silent, hypnotic power of the illusory truth. There is a paradox so ordinary, it hides in plain sight, disguised as freedom. It appears when a person stands in front of a shelf with 50 types of cereal and feels strangely paralyzed. It appears in dating apps, in Netflix menus, in modern life everywhere, choice is worshipped. This is the paradox of choice, the idea that more options, instead of empowering, can actually overwhelm. It begins with a simple promise. More choice means more freedom. More freedom means more happiness. But that promise quietly breaks. Because beyond a certain point, more options don't liberate, they suffocate. Psychologist Barry Schwartz spent years studying this. In one famous experiment, shoppers were presented with 2 tables of jam. One table had 6 flavors, the other had 24. People were more attracted to the table with more choices, but they were 10 times more likely to actually buy from the smaller set. Why? Because choice overload triggers paralysis. The mind wants options, but not too many. When faced with an excess, it freezes. And even if it does choose, it regrets. It imagines the other options. It creates ghosts of missed opportunities. This is the dark side of freedom. The more paths available, the more the mind imagines the ones not taken. And those imagined alternatives poison the one we picked. Every yes becomes haunted by 1,000 invisible no's. This is the quiet engine of modern dissatisfaction. A person chooses a job, but wonders if another would have been more fulfilling. Marries someone, but wonders about the lives not lived. Picks a show, but halfway through wonders if a better one was just a scroll away. It is the anxiety of infinite possibility, the torture of imagined perfection, and it grows worse in a world where everything is available all the time. Online shopping offers thousands of nearly identical items, but instead of feeling abundant, it makes people anxious. What if the one they chose isn't the best? What if they missed a better deal? The decision becomes a trap. The act of choosing becomes the burden, and the outcome, even if objectively good, feels tainted, because something better might have existed. This effect has been measured. People offered fewer choices are more likely to commit, more likely to be satisfied, more likely to feel confident. Those offered many options are more likely to doubt, more likely to delay, more likely to ruminate and regret. Schwartz called it the tyranny of choice, and it lives everywhere, in careers, in love, in identity, even in moral decisions. The modern self is told it can be anything, but that means it must choose everything, and every choice is a rejection. Every identity embraced means another denied. The freedom becomes a pressure, a demand, a burden of endless self-definition. Ancient societies didn't face this. Roles were clearer, life paths narrower. There were fewer choices, but also less doubt, less self-questioning, less decision fatigue. But now, the world demands customization. Every person must curate their life like a brand, and in doing so, they become exhausted. Because the brain was not built to evaluate endless possibilities, it was built to survive, to act, to move. Too much choice is not liberating, it is paralyzing. This is especially true in romantic life. Dating apps promise infinite options. Swipe left, swipe right, always someone new, but the result is not deeper love, it is shallower connections, more fear of settling, more obsession with optimization. The idea of the best infects everything. The best partner, the best job, the best version of the self. But best is a fantasy. It moves, it changes, it does not exist, and chasing it only creates emptiness. The philosopher Søren Kierkegaard called this the sickness of reflection, the state where a person thinks so much about what they could be that they forget to be anything at all. They float above life, observing, comparing, judging, but never landing, never choosing, because every choice feels like a trap. But not choosing is a choice too, and it creates its own prison. The fear of regret becomes a source of regret. The fear of missing out becomes the thing that makes us miss life. This is the paradox. The more freedom we have, the harder it becomes to use it. The more options we face, the less we act. And the more we think about what we could have done, the less we enjoy what we did. This shows up even in small ways. A person picks a meal at a restaurant, then feels disappointed, not because it was bad, but because the other dish looked better. They feel cheated by their own choice. The experience is good, but the comparison ruins it. The imagined alternative becomes a poison. It's a mental distortion called opportunity cost neglect. The brain inflates the value of what it didn't pick and diminishes what it did. This is why many people prefer fewer options. Why successful people often wear the same clothes every day. Why monks embrace simplicity. It is not about asceticism, it is about clarity, peace, liberation from the weight of endless decisions. Because the mind wants relief, not just freedom. And freedom without direction becomes chaos. So what can be done? One answer is to pre-decide, to set rules, limits, boundaries, to say, I will only browse for 10 minutes, or I will pick the first option that meets my needs, or I will not second-guess my choice once made. These are not restrictions, they are tools, anchors in a sea of uncertainty. Another answer is to shift the goal, from optimization to satisfaction, from best to good enough, from infinite possibility to present reality. The philosopher Herbert Simon called this satisficing, choosing something that is good enough, rather than endlessly searching for the best. It sounds like settling, but in practice, it brings peace, it allows action, it allows joy, because perfection is a ghost, and chasing it only ensures disappointment. The paradox of choice teaches us that too much freedom can feel like a trap, that fewer options can create more happiness, that limits are not always prisons. Sometimes they are the only way to escape one. And maybe the deeper truth is this: life is not about choosing the best. It is about choosing, then committing. It is about living the choice fully, instead of standing outside it, wondering. Because the moment is already here, the life is already happening, and the choice once made becomes real through presence, not through comparison. That is the quiet wisdom hiding in the noise, that the good life is not found in a menu. It is found in what we choose to savor. There is a paradox buried deep in human interaction, hidden beneath kindness and cruelty, nestled inside compliments and insults alike. It is called the paradox of tolerance, and it reveals the uncomfortable truth that unlimited tolerance can lead to the death of tolerance itself. The philosopher Karl Popper first wrote about this in 1945. He was watching fascism rise, watching how a free society allowed its own enemies to grow within its walls, and he realized something haunting. If a society is tolerant without limit, it ends up being destroyed by the intolerant. Because the intolerant do not play fair, they do not seek balance, they do not offer space, they exploit the very freedoms they despise. And so, in order to preserve tolerance, a society must be willing to draw a line, to be intolerant of intolerance. This sounds simple, but it is not. Because it violates the very principle it's trying to protect, it creates a contradiction. In order to protect openness, we must sometimes close. In order to defend speech, we must sometimes silence. In order to prevent cruelty, we must sometimes act with harshness. This is not just a social issue, it is a psychological one. People face this paradox internally. When is it wise to forgive? When is it naive? When does patience become complicity? When does empathy become a weapon used against the empath? In relationships, this paradox appears when one person keeps making excuses for the other. They're just stressed. They didn't mean it. They'll change. The tolerant partner tries to hold space, to stay kind, to be understanding, but slowly their boundaries are worn away. And by the time they see the damage, the person they were tolerating has taken everything. In political systems, it plays out the same way. Democracies that allow extremist voices in the name of free speech often find those voices do not reciprocate the courtesy. They use that speech to spread hate, to dismantle the very structure that allowed them in. And by the time society realizes what's happening, the damage is already deep. History is full of this. Weimar Germany allowed the Nazis to rise through legal means. The Roman Republic collapsed partly because it tolerated corruption too long. In both cases, the openness of the system became the weakness, and the people who knew better waited too long to act, because they didn't want to be intolerant. They didn't want to be hypocrites. But evil does not wait for permission. It enters quietly, wearing the mask of fairness. The paradox deepens, because if we suppress the intolerant too early, we become authoritarian, but if we wait too long, they take over. So the question becomes, when is the right time to draw the line? There is no formula, no clear sign. It requires judgment, courage, a willingness to hold contradiction. The paradox of tolerance is not about hating those who disagree. It is about recognizing when disagreement turns into dehumanization, when ideas become weapons, when voices call not for debate, but for domination. And in those moments, tolerance must end. Not because it is weak, but because it is strong. This is true on an individual level too. A person who tolerates everything will eventually tolerate abuse. They will call it love. They will call it compassion. But really, it is fear. The fear of conflict. The fear of being called cruel. But boundaries are not cruelty. They are protection. And sometimes, love must say no. Sometimes, kindness must mean walking away. This is difficult, especially for those raised to be agreeable, to avoid offense, to keep the peace. But peace without boundaries is just silence in disguise. It is not harmony, it is erasure. The paradox is that tolerance only survives when it knows what it cannot accept, when it draws a hard line against those who would burn it down. Popper warned of this, but many ignored him. They thought openness was always good, that all speech was equal, that all beliefs deserved space. But not all beliefs are equal. Some beliefs are viral. They spread hate, they recruit violence, they feed on confusion. And when they are tolerated, they grow. They push out everything else, until the space for real tolerance is gone. This doesn't mean banning disagreement. It means recognizing the difference between dialogue and destruction, between questioning ideas and attacking people, between skepticism and bigotry. The line is not always clear, but it must be sought, because without it the center collapses, and all that's left is shouting, chaos, or worse, control. Even online this paradox plays out. Platforms that allow all speech in the name of freedom often become breeding grounds for hate, because the hateful are louder, more organized, more aggressive, and their voices drown out the rest soon. The platform is no longer neutral, it is hostile, and the tolerant users leave because they no longer feel safe, because freedom without structure is not freedom at all, it is anarchy, and anarchy is a vacuum, and vacuums get filled by whoever shouts the loudest. The paradox is painful, because it feels like betrayal, to silence someone, to say no, to draw a line, but the alternative is worse. Tolerance without limits becomes a suicide pact. It invites its own executioner inside. and then stands politely while the knife is sharpened. This is not just theory, it is happening now. In schools, in governments, in families, people are afraid to speak up, afraid to set boundaries, because they don't want to be intolerant. But the cost of silence is high. The cost of unchecked cruelty is even higher. And history has already taught us what happens when we wait too long. So the paradox must be understood. Not to justify hate, but to prevent it. Not to promote censorship, but to preserve truth. Not to crush freedom, but to keep it breathing. Real tolerance is not soft, it is fierce. It protects the vulnerable. It draws lines with compassion. And it holds space only for those who would do the same. Anything else is surrender. So in a world full of contradictions, this might be the most important one to face. But the paradox of tolerance is not a problem to solve. It is a balance to hold, a tension to live with, and a reminder that even kindness must have edges. There is a paradox so quietly present in every conversation, every debate, every judgment we make about others, that most never realize it exists. It is called the fundamental attribution error, and it reveals something troubling about how humans understand human behavior. The paradox is this: when someone else does something wrong, we blame their character. When we do something wrong, we blame the situation. A man cuts someone off in traffic, and he's an arrogant jerk, selfish and impatient. But when we cut someone off, it's because we were running late, or distracted, or didn't see them. Their behavior is a reflection of who they are. Ours is a result of what we're going through. This mental shortcut is not just unfair, it is deeply baked into the way we think. Psychologists like Lee Ross and Edward Jones studied this effect in the 1970s and found it over and over again. People consistently underestimate the power of context in other people's actions and overestimate it in their own. It doesn't matter if the situation is simple or complex. The mind takes the shortcut. It goes straight to judgment. It feels truth, even when it's wrong. This creates a dangerous kind of blindness, because it means we are constantly misreading each other, mistaking external struggles for internal flaws, seeing malice where there is only exhaustion, seeing stupidity where there is only distraction, seeing cruelty where there is only confusion. And once we make that judgment, it sticks. First impressions harden, labels form. He's lazy, she's arrogant, they're just difficult. Rarely do we ask what pressure they might be under, what pain they might be hiding, what unseen circumstances shape the moment. This is not just an interpersonal problem, it's a structural one. Systems built on judgment, legal, educational, political, often ignore context. A child acting out in class gets labelled a problem. But maybe they didn't eat. Maybe home is violent. Maybe their brain is wired differently. A criminal gets painted as evil. But maybe they were raised in chaos. Maybe they were surviving. Maybe they never had a choice that looked like a future. But the system doesn't ask. It sees the action, then assigns a character. This is the paradox, that humans who are complex, layered, shaped by countless factors, are reduced to a single label based on a single act. And the quieter half of the paradox is this: we rarely apply that same harshness to ourselves. When we lie, we say it was to protect someone. When we snap, we say we were tired. When we fail, we say the system was rigged. And we might be right, but we don't extend that same compassion to others. Because from the outside, all we see is behaviour. And from the inside, all we feel is intention. This is called the empathy gap, and it lives in the space between seeing and feeling. Philosopher Hannah Arendt wrestled with this during the Eichmann trial. She observed a man who organised mass murder, yet seemed ordinary, bureaucratic, not a monster, just a man following rules. Her conclusion shocked the world. Evil can be banal. People are not always cruel out of hatred. Sometimes they are just disconnected, number, obedient. And that disconnection between the act and the internal state is part of what makes evil possible. The attribution error is not just an error, It is a crack in the mirror of empathy, a place where projection replaces perception, where judgment replaces understanding. And it explains why forgiveness is so rare, why polarization is so common, why people believe they are good while others are bad. The self is always the exception, the other is always the example. But if the roles were reversed, would the story be the same? Would the person judged as selfish still look that way if we lived their life? If we grew up in their body, with their parents, their fears, their wounds? Philosopher John Rawls once proposed a thought experiment, the veil of ignorance. Imagine designing a society without knowing what position you'd hold in it. No idea if you'd be rich or poor, healthy or sick, privileged or oppressed. How would you make the rules? Most people, when stripped of their bias, choose fairness, because when we don't know who we'll be, we imagine being the vulnerable one. The same can be applied here. What if we judged others as if we might become them? What if we looked at every action and asked, what would have to be true for me to act that way? Not to excuse it, but to understand it. That's the missing piece. The paradox shows us that empathy requires imagination, and most people don't use it. They assume too quickly, decide too fast, because assumption is easier than inquiry. And yet, this very error makes us blind to our own growth. If someone is labelled early as lazy or dumb or dangerous, society often treats them that way forever, and then punishes them for becoming what it expected. This is called a self-fulfilling prophecy. The label shapes the treatment shapes the outcome, and the outcome justifies the label. The loop tightens, the error deepens, and soon the person has no escape. Their identity becomes a prison. This happens in families, in schools, in prisons, in politics. The person stops being a person and becomes a symbol, an enemy, a mistake. And when that happens, violence is easier. Dehumanization begins with misattribution, with forgetting that behavior is not the whole story, that the context matters, that even the worst decisions can come from pain. Viktor Frankl, a Holocaust survivor and psychiatrist, once said that between stimulus and response, there is a space, and in that space is the power to choose, to pause, to see, to understand. That space is what the attribution error steals. It replaces the space with certainty, with story, with simplification, and in doing so, it cuts off the possibility of empathy, of connection, of truth. So the next time someone disappoints or offends or shocks, pause. Ask not, what kind of person does this, but what kind of situation creates this? The answers are not always comforting, but they are always more human. The paradox is not a flaw, it is a mirror. It shows us how quick we are to judge and how slow we are to understand. And in seeing that, we get a choice, to keep projecting or to start perceiving. There is a paradox so ancient it has outlived empires, and yet it still shatters minds in its simplicity. It's called the Sorite's paradox, or more poetically, the paradox of the heap. Imagine a single grain of sand. No one would call it a heap. Add another grain. Still not a heap. Add one more. Still not. But if you keep adding grains, at some point something changes. Eventually, we start calling it a heap. But where exactly did the shift happen? Was it after 10 grains, 100, $10,000? There's no obvious line. The change from not a heap to heap is smooth, continuous, and yet we treat the result as categorical. This reveals something subtle and strange about how humans process change. Small changes feel meaningless, but enough small changes become a transformation. The same paradox applies in reverse. Start with a heap and remove one grain at a time. At what point is it no longer a heap? The answer slips through the fingers, like the sand itself. This isn't just a game of semantics. It's a mirror of how we live, how we age, how we love, how we lose ourselves. No one wakes up and says, "Today I became old," or "Today the love is gone," or today I'm a different person. But over time, the grains fall. One choice, one habit, one loss, one distraction, and slowly the self shifts, imperceptibly. Until one day we look in the mirror and do not recognize the face, but we cannot say when the change occurred. This is the haunting beauty of gradualness. It hides transformation in plain sight. The philosopher Buridan posed the paradox 2,400 years ago, and it still hasn't been resolved, because it points to a deeper problem in language and logic. The human mind craves categories, sharp lines, definitions, but reality is rarely so clean. Most things in life exist on a spectrum. When does day become night? When does warm become hot? When does a child become an adult? When does pain become trauma? When does silence become neglect? The answers are fuzzy, and yet we live as if they are clear. We build laws, judgments, identities on top of vague lines. And that vagueness becomes dangerous, because it allows denial. A person gaining weight doesn't notice each pound. A society losing freedom doesn't notice each law. A mind losing hope doesn't notice each dull day. Until it is too late. Until the heap is gone or formed. And no one knows when it happened. This is why the paradox matters. It's not just about language, it's about blindness. The blindness of slow change. The kind that creeps, not crashes. That rusts, not shatters. And that's the kind of change that shapes most of our lives. The Stoics warned of this. Epictetus said, "No man becomes wicked all at once. Evil begins with excuses, with small lies, with tolerated cruelties, and those grains too pile up, one after another, until the character is changed. The person is gone, and all that's left is the heap." This also explains how habits form. One skipped workout, one late night, one extra drink, meaningless on their own, but over time they accumulate. They write a new story, and because no single act felt important, we miss the moment the narrative changed. This is the tragic irony. The moments that shape us the most are often the ones we ignore, because they're small, because they're quiet, because they feel safe. But they're not. They're building something, or dismantling something, and we won't realize it until the structure falls. This paradox also lives in ethics. When does poverty become injustice? When does surveillance become oppression? When does inequality become immorality? These aren't questions of numbers, they're questions of perspective. And the answers shift depending on who's asking. Power loves the Sorites paradox, because it allows harm to hide in technicalities. If one law isn't oppressive, then why not one more? And another? And another? If one insult isn't abuse, then why not a dozen? If one lie isn't corruption, then why not many? This is how erosion works. It doesn't announce itself, it just continues. And by the time anyone notices, the coast is gone. The identity is gone. The meaning is gone. But there is a quieter side to the paradox too. A gentler wisdom. Just as harm accumulates, so does healing. One kind act, one honest moment, one brave choice. Alone they feel small, insignificant. But they are grains too. They pile up. They reshape the mind, the heart, the world. This is the slow miracle of growth. It never feels like a miracle while it's happening, but it is. It is a heap forming, one grain at a time. This is how people rebuild after loss, how they change their lives. Not with one giant leap, but with steady steps, invisible progress, quiet revolutions. And so the paradox teaches two things. First, beware of slow decline. It does not feel like danger, but it is. And second, believe in slow ascent. It does not feel like triumph, but it is. The philosopher Derek Parfit once said that identity is not what we think, that the self is not a single, unchanging thing. It is a series of overlapping moments, like a rope made of fibers. No one fiber runs through the entire length, but the rope holds, the self holds, even though it changes. And the paradox lives there too, because we want to believe in permanence, in thresholds, in clear lines. But life is a blur, and meaning is made in the blur, not in the extremes, but in the spaces between, the grains, the slow burn. So maybe the lesson is not to solve the paradox, but to live with it, to know that change is always happening, that transformation is always underway, and that the most important moments are often the quietest, because they are the ones that add up, the ones that build or undo, the ones we don't notice until everything has changed. That is the paradox of the heap, that something can become something else, and no one can say when. There is a paradox that sits at the heart of identity, a quiet riddle that whispers every time a person looks into a mirror or remembers who they used to be. It is called the ship of Theseus, and it asks a question so simple it feels like a trick. If every single part of a ship is replaced over time, is it still the same ship? Imagine the ancient Greek hero Theseus returns home after battle. His ship is honoured, preserved. But the wood begins to rot, and plank by plank, the ship is repaired. After many years, not one original piece remains. Yet it is still called the ship of Theseus. The people still believe it is. But what if the discarded parts were collected and rebuilt into a ship elsewhere? Now there are two ships. Which one is the real one? The one with continuity, or the one with original parts? This is not just a problem for philosophers, it is a problem for everyone. Because humans are not static. Every 7 years, almost every cell in the body has regenerated, the brain rewires, the skin sheds, the self shifts. The person you were at 10 is not the person you are at 30. Not biologically, not mentally, not emotionally. So who are you really? The continuity, the story, or the parts? The paradox opens something uncomfortable. It exposes the illusion of permanence, the lie of identity as something fixed. Because we don't just change slowly, we rebuild ourselves constantly. Beliefs evolve, habits shift, values transform, and yet we cling to the idea of a single, coherent me. We say, I've always been this way, but it's not true. The mind forgets its own contradictions. The person who once feared public speaking now teaches. The one who hated reading now writes. The one who swore never to forgive has softened. These are not glitches, they are the design. Human identity is fluid. Not a stone, but a river. But the paradox runs deeper. Because memory is not reliable, it rewrites itself. Neuroscience shows that every time a memory is recalled, it is altered slightly. Re-encoded, influenced by mood, language, even context. Over time, memories become memories of memories. And so, the past we use to define ourselves is a fiction, crafted, revised, curated. The self is not just built from parts. It is built from stories about those parts, and the stories change. The philosopher David Hume said the self is an illusion, that if you look inward, you won't find a constant I only, a bundle of perceptions, sensations, thoughts, ever shifting. Like a flame that seems still, but is never the same from moment to moment. The paradox of the ship of Theseus is not about ships, it is about this, about what it means to be a person, about whether there is a core or just layers. It also explains the pain of nostalgia, the ache we feel for our younger selves, because the child we once were is gone, but their name is still ours, their body is gone, their fears, their joys, but we still feel connected. Why? Because of memory, because of story, because of a belief in a thread that runs through all the versions of us. But is that thread real, or is it something we invented to stay sane? The paradox haunts relationships too. People fall in love with who someone is, but people change, sometimes slowly, sometimes suddenly. And then the question appears, is this the same person? If every part of them has changed, their beliefs, their habits, their reactions, is the relationship the same? Or is it a new one wearing old clothes? This is why long-term relationships are not about staying the same. They're about adapting, re-meeting, loving not just who someone was, but who they are becoming, or not. And when that no longer aligns, the heartbreak comes not from betrayal, but from change, from a person becoming someone else, while still holding your memories. The paradox touches everything: art, identity, culture. If a painting is restored, repainted, re-stretched, is it still the original? If a tradition evolves, modernizes, reinvents itself, is it still the same tradition? Or has it died and been reborn? These questions don't have answers, but they shape how we think, how we grieve, how we grow. The Buddhist idea of anatta echoes this, the doctrine of no self, the belief that clinging to a fixed identity is the root of suffering. That peace comes from accepting impermanence, from flowing with change instead of resisting it. But the Western mind struggles with this. It wants permanence, wants roots, wants certainty. And so it constructs an identity like a fortress, even if the bricks are always being replaced. This is the paradox, that the self is both illusion and experience, that it is not fixed but it feels fixed, that the person we wake up as today is not quite the one who fell asleep, but we need to believe we are one, because otherwise what holds the life together? What justifies the consequences of yesterday's choices? What makes morality possible? Responsibility? Love? And yet, knowing the paradox does not weaken the self. It deepens it, it humbles it, it allows us to forgive old versions of ourselves, to see change not as betrayal, but as evolution, to look at others and say, they are not who they were, and neither am I, and that's okay. The paradox does not destroy identity, it softens its edges, it makes room for growth, for contradiction, for transformation. So maybe the question isn't which ship is real, maybe the answer is both or neither. Maybe identity is not a single vessel, but the journey itself, the ocean it sails, the storms it survives, the horizon it chases, and the person, like the ship, is not the wood or the nails or the name, but the motion, the movement, the memory of what was and the dream of what might be. There is a paradox that hides in the corridors of logic, a riddle that seems to make time itself collapse inward, folding past and future into a knot of contradictions. It's the grandfather paradox, the strange thought experiment that appears whenever time travel is imagined seriously. It begins simply. Imagine a person builds a time machine and travels to the past. There, they find their grandfather before he ever had children, and for whatever reason, accident, malice, curiosity, they prevent the grandfather from ever meeting the grandmother. The result, the time traveller is never born. But if they are never born, how did they go back in time to do it? If they never existed, then they couldn't interfere. But if they didn't interfere, then they do exist. And if they do exist, then they can interfere. And if they interfere, then they don't exist. The logic circles endlessly. This isn't just science fiction. It's a real problem in metaphysics, a kind of thought trap that exposes how fragile our understanding of causality really is. It shows how tightly time and identity are woven together, and how easily the thread unravels when one loop is tugged. Philosophers and physicists have debated this for decades. One possible resolution is the idea of multiple timelines, that changing the past doesn't erase the future. It creates a new branch, a parallel world where things unfolded differently. But this doesn't really solve the paradox, it just moves it. Because then we must ask, what is the original timeline? Where is the self anchored? If every decision spawns a new reality, what happens to the self that made the choice? And what does choice even mean if every possibility already exists somewhere? This is the deeper paradox, that time travel forces us to question not just cause and effect, but freedom and selfhood. Because time as we experience it is linear. One direction, one flow, past causes present, which causes future. That's the story we live inside. But if time can loop, or split, or be revisited, then everything collapses. Effects cause causes, Futures birth pasts. Identity becomes unstable, and so does morality. Imagine travelling back in time to stop a tragedy, a war, an atrocity, but in doing so, you erase the chain of events that led you to care about stopping it. You undo your own purpose, you delete the meaning of your own choice, and then, paradoxically, you no longer choose it. The act of prevention prevents the reason for acting. This loop is not just theoretical, it echoes in daily life. Think of regret, of all the moments you wish you could undo, but if you did, you wouldn't be the person who regrets them. Regret shapes us, pain sculpts empathy, failure teaches, remove them, and the lesson disappears too. The past wounds, but it also builds. The philosopher Kierkegaard said, "Life can only be understood backward, but must be lived forward." That tension, that asymmetry, is where meaning lives. But time travel breaks that. It offers the illusion of symmetry. The idea that we can revise the past like a document. But the past is not a document. It is a graveyard, a memory, a force. And the paradox reminds us, meddling with it unravels more than it repairs. There's also the problem of knowledge. If a time traveler brings back information from the future, say a new technology, who invented it? If they learned it in the future and taught it in the past, the idea has no origin. It exists in a loop with no creator. This is called a bootstrap paradox, a thing that causes itself, a knowledge without a knower. And it breaks the chain of authorship. It suggests that information can exist outside time, detached from minds. But this isn't how knowledge works. Ideas have histories, contexts. They grow, evolve. They don't appear fully formed, like Athena from the head of Zeus. Yet in the paradox, they do. And that's deeply unsettling, because it means something can exist without beginning, without cause. And if that's possible for an idea, what about a person? What about a self? Could identity be caught in the same loop? Born from a memory that was never lived, shaped by a past that was never real. It sounds absurd, but memory is slippery. False memories feel just as vivid as true ones. Experiments show that people can be convinced they did things that never happened, simply by imagining them repeatedly. The brain fills in gaps, invents meaning, rewrites history. So maybe the paradox is not about time machines at all. Maybe it's about how the mind travels through its own timeline, editing, deleting, reinterpreting, creating loops of causality inside consciousness itself. You remember being hurt, so you see yourself as fragile, so you avoid risk, so you miss opportunities, so you feel regret, so you remember being hurt. The loop continues, just like the grandfather paradox, a self that births its own story again and again. This is not science fiction, it's psychology, and it reveals how much of identity is built on feedback. Loops, memory shaping behavior shaping memory. The past isn't just behind us, it's inside us, repeating, echoing, haunting, and sometimes healing. The paradox also touches ethics. If you could go back and change one thing, kill a tyrant, save a life, undo a betrayal, would you? Should you? And if you did, who would you become? Someone who never learned the lesson? Someone who never made the mistake? Is that better or just different? Nietzsche imagined a similar thought experiment. The eternal return. The idea that you must live your life over and over, exactly the same, forever. Every choice, every mistake, repeated endlessly. Could you embrace that? Could you love your fate enough to live it again? That's the real challenge, not to change the past, but to make peace with it, to live so that even your worst moments belong. Not because they were good, but because they were yours. The grandfather paradox pretends to be about time, but it's really about responsibility, about whether we can accept the unchangeable, about whether we can live without the comfort of revision. In that sense, we are all time travelers, moving forward 1 second per second, and the past is always there, just out of reach, not to be altered, but to be understood, accepted, carried, because there is no machine, no reset, only this moment and the weight of the ones before it. There is a paradox so strange, so quietly embedded in how people interact with truth, that it slips beneath the surface of every conversation, every memory, every belief. It's called the Illusory Truth Effect, and it reveals something deeply unsettling. The more often we hear something, the more likely we are to believe it, whether it's true or not. Repetition becomes reality. Familiarity becomes evidence. Truth becomes a feeling. Psychologists first documented this in the 1970s in a study by Lynn Hasher, David Goldstein, and Thomas Topino. They asked participants to rate statements as true or false. Some of the statements were repeated over time, and without realizing it, people began rating the repeated statements as more accurate, even when they were completely false. This effect has been confirmed countless times since. It doesn't matter how intelligent a person is, or how skeptical. The mind is wired to confuse familiarity with truth, because fluency feels right. If a sentence flows easily, if the words are recognizable, if the idea sounds familiar, the brain assumes it's probably correct, not because of evidence, but because of ease. This is a glitch in cognition, a vulnerability, and in today's world, it's being exploited constantly. Politicians repeat the same talking points. Advertisers repeat the same slogans. Conspiracies spread not because they make sense, but because they echo, again and again, and slowly they begin to feel real. This is the eerie power of repetition. It bypasses logic. It doesn't argue, it infects. Even a lie, if heard enough, becomes emotionally sticky. It clings, not because it persuades, but because it doesn't surprise. The brain rewards predictability. It craves patterns, so a lie repeated often enough becomes more believable than a truth heard once. This is terrifying, because it means that belief is not built on reason, it's built on rhythm, on exposure, on the soft hypnosis of hearing something until it becomes part of the mental furniture. This also explains the persistence of stereotypes, of rumours, of political myths. Once something has been heard a dozen times, it begins to feel self-evident. And the more people believe it, the more they repeat it. And the cycle tightens. Even people who know better begin to doubt, begin to soften, begin to wonder. If so many are saying it, maybe there's something to it. But there isn't. Not necessarily. Truth does not increase with volume, but the feeling of truth does. That's the trap. And it gets worse, because the effect is even stronger when people are distracted. When they're tired, overwhelmed, emotionally taxed. In those states, they rely more on mental shortcuts, on what feels familiar. This is why misinformation thrives during crises, during wars, during pandemics. People are exhausted. They stop analysing. They default to what they've heard before. And so the lie grows stronger, not because it's hidden, but because it's everywhere. The philosopher Hannah Arendt warned about this. She said the ideal subject of totalitarian rule is not the committed believer, but the person for whom the distinction between fact and fiction no longer matters. And that's exactly what the illusory truth effect creates: a fog, a space where reality blurs, where people stop caring about what's true and start caring about what feels true, and feeling is easier than thinking. That's the danger. But the paradox goes deeper, because this effect isn't just external. It lives inside the self. People repeat stories about who they are. I'm not good enough. I always mess up. No one ever really stays. These mantras are quiet, private, but they're powerful. Repetition shapes belief, and belief shapes identity. The self becomes a loop of phrases said over time, many of which were never questioned, only echoed. A parent says a child is lazy, over and over. Eventually, the child agrees. Not because it's accurate, but because it's familiar. A partner says, someone is too sensitive, again and again. And over time, that becomes the story, the narrative, the inner truth. But it's not truth, it's repetition. And once that loop starts, it's hard to break. Because it feels real, and the mind prefers what feels real to what actually is. This is how people become trapped in false identities, not through force, but through repetition. The same labels, the same assumptions, the same inner voice, playing the same tune, and it becomes the soundtrack of their life. Quiet, relentless, convincing, but the loop can be broken. That's the hope inside the paradox. If repetition builds false truth, then repetition can also build real strength. Repeating kindness, repeating courage, repeating reminders of worth. Over time, those words begin to sink in too. They start to feel real, not because they surprise, but because they comfort. And comfort, like fluency, becomes evidence. This is why affirmations work. Not because they're magic, but because they're counter-hypnosis. A way to drown out the echo of old lies, to flood the brain with new patterns, until the new feels familiar, until the familiar feels true, until the truth feels like home. But it takes time. The same time the lie was given, maybe more, because lies are loud and truth is often quiet, but the mind is not fixed. It can learn, unlearn, rewire, slowly, gently, through repetition. So the illusory truth effect is not just a vulnerability, it's also a tool, a mirror. It shows how belief is formed, and once we see that, we can choose what we want to believe, what we want to hear again and again, what we want to become true through time. Because identity is not just biology, it's echo, and the echoes we feed become the life we live. That is the paradox. That truth is not immune to repetition, and neither are we. There is a paradox in human logic that quietly governs every courtroom, every argument, every hour spent in self-defense. It is the paradox of Buridan's ass, a medieval thought experiment so simple it seems absurd, yet it exposes a cruel truth about indecision. Imagine a donkey placed exactly halfway between two identical piles of hay. Both piles are equally full, equally fresh, equally close. The donkey, having no reason to choose one over the other, cannot decide. It stands still, starves, dies not from lack of options but from perfect symmetry. This is the essence of the paradox, that when every choice seems equally justified, choice becomes impossible. And what kills isn't malice, it's hesitation. Now replace the donkey with a human mind. Replace the hay with two lovers, two careers, two cities, two dreams, equally appealing, equally risky, and watch the paralysis set in. Watch the person spin in circles, thinking, calculating, doubting, waiting for a sign that never comes. They don't starve exactly, but they suffer. From inertia, from time lost, from roads never taken. This paradox was named after the 14th century philosopher Jean Buridan, who believed reason should guide decision-making. But the paradox reveals something else. That reason alone, when faced with perfect symmetry, collapses. It needs friction, a floor to lean on, a whisper of preference. Otherwise, it loops. And the mind, when stuck in that loop, becomes cruel to itself. It begins to see its indecision as weakness, as failure. But it's not weakness, it's the cost of consciousness. Because animals don't ruminate, they don't spiral, they act. But humans, we think ourselves into corners. We believe every decision must be the right one. That certainty is possible. And so, when faced with two equal options, we freeze. We wait for clarity. But clarity never comes. Because the future can't be known. And the past can't be consulted. And so we orbit. This is not just philosophical. It's neurological. Studies in behavioral economics show that people will avoid making a decision altogether if the options are too similar. They'll postpone, procrastinate, distract, not because they don't care, but because they care too much. They want to be right, and that desire becomes a trap. This is the paradox. The more we want to choose wisely, the harder it becomes to choose at all. And time, indifferent and slow, moves on. The hay begins to rot. The doors begin to close. And still we hesitate. There's a story of a man who had 2 marriage proposals at once. Both women loved him. Both were kind, intelligent, compatible. He spent years trying to decide, and by the time he did, both women had moved on. His life, he said later, was defined by that indecision. Not because either option was bad, but because he never chose. This is the quiet cruelty of the paradox, that a choice avoided is still a choice made. And often the cost of not choosing is greater than the cost of choosing poorly. Because action creates feedback, mistakes teach, success rewards. But stillness? Stillness teaches nothing. Stillness leaves no mark. And in that void, the mind begins to rot. But the paradox deepens. Because sometimes indecision is disguised as logic. People make pros and cons lists. They gather more data. They seek more opinions. But often this is just delay. The search for certainty is endless. There is always more to know, always more to fear. And so we hide in that search. We call it preparation. But it's avoidance, a fear of regret dressed as rationality. But regret is not something you avoid by choosing perfectly. It's something you accept by choosing fully. That's the difference. A person who commits to a decision, even if it's wrong, learns. They gain a self. But the person who waits too long dissolves into fragments. They become a ghost of all the lives they never lived. And yet, society often rewards overthinking. It calls it intelligence, it praises analysis, but intelligence without action is impotence. It builds nothing, changes nothing. It just observes, records, judges, but it doesn't live. The Stoics knew this. Seneca said that it's not that life is too short, but that we waste so much of it. And one of the greatest wastes is paralysis, the slow bleeding of time through undecided hours. And it doesn't have to be this way. Because the solution to the paradox is not more thinking, it's action. Any action, a bias toward movement. Not recklessness, but willingness to be wrong, to change course, to begin even without certainty. Because beginning teaches more than planning ever will. The Zen Buddhists say that the mind is like a muddy pond. The more you stir it, the cloudier it gets. Sometimes the answer comes not from thinking more, but from thinking less. From stillness, from listening, from a deep knowing that can't be explained, only felt. And maybe that's what the donkey needed. Not more options, but less thought. A nudge, a breeze, a moment of instinct. Because even a bad meal is better than starvation, and even a wrong path can lead to something right. So the next time the mind loops, ask, is the problem really the choice? Or is it the fear of choosing? And if it's fear, what's being protected? Ego, image, control? Because those are illusions, and they cost more than they save. The paradox of Buridan's ass is not about animals, it's about humans who forget how to act, who wait for perfect conditions, who don't realize that waiting is its own kind of death. So choose, not recklessly, but bravely. Choose with full heart and open hands, knowing that no path is certain, and that's what makes it alive. There is a paradox that infects the very roots of communication, a quiet corruption buried deep in how humans use language to convey truth. And it goes like this. This sentence is false. Just 6 words. 6 simple words that create a loop so violent it threatens to swallow logic itself. Because if the sentence is true, then what it says must be the case. But what it says is that it's false. So if it's true, then it must be false. But if it's false, then it is not the case that the sentence is false, meaning it must be true. And around we go. This is the liar paradox, and it has tormented philosophers for over 2,000 years. It appears harmless, even childish, but it cuts deep into the foundations of truth, meaning, and belief. The first known version came from the Greek philosopher Epimenides, who was himself a Cretan, saying, "All Cretans are liars." If that's true, and he is a Cretan, then he must be lying, which means the statement is false. But if it's false, then not all Cretans are liars, meaning at least one is telling the truth. Possibly Epimenides. But then it would be true again. A circle, a trap. And it doesn't stop with language. It sneaks into thought, into systems, into every attempt to create rules that refer to themselves. In the 20th century, the logician Kurt Gödel formalized this loop into a terrifying conclusion that any sufficiently powerful logical system will contain statements that cannot be proven true or false within that system. His incompleteness theorems weren't just clever math, they shattered the dream of a perfect, complete logic. They proved that some truths lie forever, out of reach. That paradox is not a glitch. It is part of the structure, a feature, not a bug, and it mirrors something in human psychology. People do this all the time without knowing. I'm a fraud, someone whispers to themselves. But if that's true and they're telling the truth, then they're not a fraud, are they? Or someone says, I can't be trusted. But if they're right, then they can be trusted to tell the truth about not being trustworthy, which is already a contradiction. These loops are more than cute riddles. They represent how people turn against themselves, how self-doubt becomes a trap that reason cannot escape. This happens in relationships too. A person says, I don't deserve to be loved, but if they're right and they don't deserve love, then how could that self-awareness exist in someone unworthy of it? That contradiction is the opening. But most people never find it. They get lost in the loop. The paradox is also political. A government that says all media is propaganda is making a claim that invalidates itself, because the government is also a medium. And if all media lies, then their statement is a lie too, which means maybe not all media lies, but then the original claim might be true. And the trust collapses. These are recursive traps, and the modern world is full of them. Self-cancelling slogans, self-refuting beliefs, systems that destroy their own foundations while pretending to be solid. That's the dark power of the liar paradox. It allows people, institutions, and ideologies to weaponize contradiction. And the human brain, desperate for consistency, either rejects the loop or shuts down. But some learn to live with it, to see that truth is not always binary. That language is not math. That meaning can be unstable, even slippery, and still be meaningful. There's a quiet strength in that. Because paradox is not always something to solve. Sometimes it's something to hold, to sit with. Like a koan in Zen Buddhism, a question with no answer, meant to break the mind open. What is the sound of one hand clapping? What did your face look like before your parents were born? These are not nonsense. They are designed confusion, tools of awakening, because confusion can humble the ego, strip away certainty, force a deeper seeing. And maybe the liar paradox is that kind of tool, a crack in the wall of logic, a glimpse into the mystery beneath reason. It also lives in art, in stories where the narrator is unreliable and the truth can't be known. Where the artist says, everything I say is a lie, and yet the art moves us, feeds us, heals us. So what then? Is the lie a kind of truth? Is the falsehood more honest than the facts? The philosopher Nietzsche said, we have art so that we may not perish from the truth. Perhaps paradox is part of that. A necessary dissonance, a spiritual vertigo, a reminder that the map is never the territory, that every statement, no matter how precise, leaves something out, and that even in contradiction, there can be revelation. This paradox also explains why humans can hold conflicting beliefs, why someone can fight for freedom while fearing difference, why someone can love and resent at the same time, why people say, I'm fine when they're not, because language is limited and emotion is layered. And the mind is not a spreadsheet, it's a storm, a theatre, a collage, and sometimes the contradictions are not signs of failure. They're signs of depth, of humanity, of truth too large to fit in one sentence. So when someone says, this sentence is false, maybe the answer is not to solve it. Maybe the answer is to smile, to nod, to say, yes, I know the feeling, because we've all been there, in that loop, in that echo chamber, where belief eats itself and doubt grows claws. But we are not trapped, we are just spinning. And sometimes the way out is not through logic, it's through laughter, through letting go, through seeing that the paradox is part of the dance. And that the dance goes on? There is a paradox buried in human motivation so quietly pervasive, it stains almost every ambition. And it begins with this question: if someone is doing good only for the reward of being praised, are they really doing good at all? This is the paradox of moral luck, the eerie contradiction where outcomes define morality more than intentions do, where people are judged not for what they meant to do, but for what actually happened, often by accident. A person drives home drunk and makes it safely. Another drives drunk and hits a pedestrian. One is labelled reckless but lucky, the other criminal. But their decisions were the same, only fortune changed. And yet society punishes one and forgets the other. That's the paradox. Morality is supposed to be about choice, about intention, but in reality, it's judged through the lens of outcome, even if the outcome is governed by randomness. The term moral luck was coined by philosopher Bernard Williams and later developed by Thomas Nagel, who showed how much of what we call character is shaped by circumstance. A person born into war may become hardened, violent, cynical. Another born into peace may seem naturally kind. But are they really more virtuous, or just more fortunate? The question echoes through history. Heroes and villains often share the same beginnings: poverty, struggle, trauma. But one finds a cause, the other chaos. One becomes Mandela, the other Stalin. Is that moral superiority, or a different roll of the dice? And if the line between evil and greatness is so thin, so fragile, so circumstantial, then what does it mean to be good? This is the uncomfortable truth, that the self is not sealed. It is shaped, nudged, warped. The philosopher Susan Wolf once asked whether anyone would remain moral if they were placed in every possible position that tempts people to do wrong. Most believe they would, but history says otherwise. When roles shift, so do behaviours. The Stanford prison experiment showed this painfully. Ordinary people assigned as guards began abusing their power within days, not because they were evil, but because the role allowed it, encouraged it, rewarded it. And this is the deeper paradox. People want to believe in free will, in moral agency, in being the author of their choices. But their environment, their culture, their genes, their stress levels, all influence their actions. So is morality a personal achievement or a privilege? Is goodness a choice or a condition? And if someone born into love becomes loving, is that virtue or luck? These questions hurt because they challenge fairness. They suggest that judgment, praise, even punishment may be based more on fortune than merit. And yet, society must judge. It must draw lines, reward virtue, deter vice. So it pretends the playing field is level. But it's not. And somewhere deep down, everyone knows it. That's why people fear bad luck. Not just for the suffering, but for the judgment that comes with it. A person loses their job and is seen as irresponsible. A person falls into addiction and is blamed for weakness, even when both were born into hardship, into pain, into histories not of their own making. But the paradox doesn't just apply to ethics, it applies to achievement too. Success feels earned. But how much of it was timing? Geography, genes, mentors? A single choice made by a stranger? Think of J.K. Rowling. 12 publishers rejected her manuscript. One said yes. Was it talent that made her? Or luck? Or both? And would her talent have mattered if that one person said no? Then there's the paradox of the control group. In science, to know if something works, there must be a control. Those who receive nothing, and often those people suffer. Not because they chose to, but because they were randomized, and yet their suffering is necessary for the greater good. But from their perspective, they simply drew the short straw. This is moral luck again, doing everything right, but still getting the wrong outcome. And it shatters the illusion that effort guarantees reward. It doesn't. Not always. And yet people are told, you get what you give. Hard work pays off. Sometimes it doesn't. And this isn't pessimism, it's realism, it's humility, it's the quiet recognition that control is partial. That effort matters, but so does chance. And this awareness can soften judgment. Make room for compassion, because the person who failed may have tried just as hard. The person who fell may have climbed just as high. But the floor gave out, or the wind changed, and in another life, the roles might have reversed. That's the haunting part. That the villain in one story could be the hero in another, with just one variable changed. Viktor Frankl, a psychiatrist and Holocaust survivor, saw this in the camps. He wrote that some guards were kinder than expected, some prisoners crueler. That suffering revealed the soul, but not always how one would think, and that sometimes luck decided who lived, who kept their humanity, who became something else. The paradox of moral luck doesn't mean morality is fake. It means it's fragile, contingent, intertwined with things outside the self. And this knowledge can either paralyze or purify. It can make people cynical, or it can make them kind. Because if goodness is partly luck, then no one is fully superior. And if failure is partly luck, then no one is fully damned. And that levels the field, softens the ego, opens the door to forgiveness, not just of others, but of oneself. Because everyone is both lucky and unlucky, both judge and victim, both choice and circumstance. And in that tension, something beautiful can grow. Not moral perfection, but moral humility. A way of living that knows it might have been different. That sees itself in the other. That understands the power of conditions and still chooses again and again to be gentle, even when it's hard, even when it's unfair, even when the world does not reward it. Because luck may shape outcomes, but choice shapes character. And sometimes, character is the only thing that's truly ours. There is a paradox so old and yet so fresh it echoes in the silence between every question and every answer, and it begins with this. What if the more we try to define something, the less we understand it? What if chasing knowledge sometimes pushes it further away? This is the paradox of inquiry, also called Meno's paradox, first raised by Plato in a dialogue between Socrates and a man named Meno. The puzzle goes like this. If one knows what they're looking for, then inquiry is unnecessary. But if one doesn't know what they're looking for, then how will they recognize it when they find it? Either way, seeking seems impossible. To search, one must know. But if one already knows, there's no need to search. And if one doesn't know, then the search cannot begin. It is a trap, a circle, a contradiction hidden at the core of all curiosity. And yet, people search anyway. They question. They learn. They reach. How? Why? This is where the paradox becomes something deeper. Not a block, but a mirror. One that reflects the mystery of consciousness itself. Socrates, as always, offers a path through. He suggests that the soul already contains knowledge from before birth, and that learning is remembering. Anamnesis, a return, a recollection of what was always there. But whether or not that's literally true, the metaphor is powerful, because it suggests that learning is not about stuffing in facts. It's about awakening, uncovering, peeling away the layers of noise and assumption to reveal something more elemental, something already known, but forgotten. And that fits, because the deepest insights often feel like déjà vu, like things we've always known, but never quite heard said aloud. This is why poetry hits harder than explanation, why music conveys truth that words fumble to describe, because some truths are not constructed, they're revealed, felt, touched, not proven. But the paradox doesn't stop with knowledge. It extends to identity, to the question, who am I? Because to answer it, one must know. But if one already knows, the question doesn't need asking. And if one doesn't know, then what is the I that's asking? Is the self both seeker and mystery, observer and illusion? That tension runs through all self-reflection, the mind turning inward only to find itself turning. And yet, the turning matters. The paradox is the point, because the asking shapes the asker. Kierkegaard said, "Life is not a problem to be solved, but a reality to be experienced." And maybe identity is the same, not a fact to be discovered, but a question to be lived. A practice, a story, a spiral. This also connects to the paradox of perfection. People chase it, define it, reach for it. But the closer they come, the more it slips away. Perfection, once named, begins to decay. It becomes static, dead, because life moves, evolves, and the perfect cannot change. So maybe what is truly perfect must also be unreachable, like a horizon, visible, guiding, but forever distant. And in that distance we move, we grow, we stretch. That is the paradox, that what we cannot reach still pulls us forward, that the unknowable still teaches. That mystery is not the enemy of knowledge, but its source. The physicist Richard Feynman once said, "I would rather have questions that can't be answered than answers that can't be questioned." That's the heart of it. That certainty is not always wisdom. That doubt is not weakness. That to live inside a question is not to be lost, but to be alive. And this is where the inquiry paradox becomes spiritual. Mystics across cultures have said the same thing. The divine cannot be named. That to define God is to diminish God. That the sacred must remain unspeakable. In Taoism, the Tao that can be told is not the eternal Tao. In apophatic theology, God is described only by what he is not. Silence becomes the truest prayer. And that silence is not emptiness. It's fullness beyond language. Because some things are too vast for definitions, too alive for categories, and the paradox invites reverence for that vastness. It teaches humility. It reminds us that not knowing is not failure. It is wonder. It is awe. And in a world addicted to certainty, awe is radical, subversive, liberating. The paradox also reveals how often people confuse answers with closure. They want definitions to feel safe, labels to feel real, but often those definitions are prisons. Someone asks, "What am I?" and society answers with a role, a label, a diagnosis. But maybe the truest answer is, you are a question. And that's not vague, that's precise, because a question moves, lives changes, it makes space, it breathes. And maybe the deepest healing comes, not from finding the answer, but from surrendering to the question, trusting that living it will reveal something truer than words. Rainer Maria Rilke once wrote, "Be patient toward all that is unsolved in your heart. Live the questions now. Perhaps you will then gradually, without noticing it, live along some distant day into the answer." That is the answer to Menno's paradox. That to inquire is to begin before knowing, to move before certainty, to open without closure. That the question itself is the compass, not because it leads to a destination, but because it creates the path. This is why children learn faster than adults. They're not afraid of not knowing. They ask everything. They're not embarrassed by mystery. They live inside it. But somewhere along the way, people are taught to fear the question, to seek only what is already known. And in doing so, they lose the very thing that made them curious. They forget that the unknown is not a void, it's a frontier. And every moment of wonder is a rebellion against stagnation. So let the paradox live, let it breathe, let it sit, unsolved, at the centre of thought like a candle in a dark room, flickering, gentle, unyielding, because maybe the question was never meant to be answered. Maybe it was meant to change us. And in that change, something true emerges, not a fact but a way of seeing, not a solution but a way of being, one that trusts the silence, one that honors the mystery, one that knows that truth does not always arrive wrapped in clarity. Sometimes it comes as a whisper, sometimes as a wound, sometimes not at all, but always it comes to those who ask.